It's perhaps the most notorious police brutality case in recent memory, made so by an amateur photographer who captured 56 police baton blows on videotape that was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case and introduced into evidence.
4 police officers beat a man on camera for over a minute. Then a jury watched the tape and found them not guilty. 6 days later, 63 people were dead. Over $1 billion in property had burned, and the United States Army was patrolling Los Angeles. This is the story of how one traffic stop on March 3rd, 1991 became the detonator for the deadliest civil unrest in American history. The city before the match was lit. On the night of March 3rd, 1991, a 25-year-old black man named Rodney Glenn King was pulled over near Hanson Dam Park in the San Fernando Valley after leading police on a high-speed chase. 5 LAPD officers surrounded him. They shot him with a 50,000-volt taser. Then they beat him with batons. They kicked him. They stomped on him. The assault lasted over a minute. When it was over, King had 11 skull fractures, a crushed cheekbone, a broken ankle, and burns from the taser. He was not armed. He was not fighting back. Across the street, a plumber named George Holliday had stepped onto his apartment balcony with a new Sony Handycam. He pressed record. The tape he captured that night would eventually end up on television screens in every corner of the United States, and what happened next would change the country. But the story did not begin with that beating. It did not begin with Rodney King. To understand what happened in Los Angeles in April 1992, you have to go back further, to the city that was already on fire long before anyone dropped a match. Los Angeles in the 1980s was a city being hollowed out. Through the 1960s, it had been a booming industrial hub. Aerospace plants, auto factories, rubber manufacturers. By the time the 1980s ended, companies like Goodyear, Firestone, and General Motors had shut down their Los Angeles operations, eliminating more than 70,000 blue-collar jobs. The people most devastated by those closures were the ones who had fewest alternatives. Black workers who had settled in South Central Los Angeles during the Great Migration, who had built communities in Watts, Compton, and Inglewood under the assumption that the industrial economy would hold. It didn't. In South Central, unemployment among African Americans reached 50%. Almost 20% of teenagers were out of school and out of work at the same time. Whole commercial strips that had once supported middle-class black families went dark. Supermarkets closed, banks left. The infrastructure of daily life eroded and was not replaced. Into that vacuum came crack cocaine. The crack epidemic of the mid-1980s did not create poverty in South Los Angeles. It landed on top of it. The drug was cheap to make, cheap to buy, and devastatingly addictive. It spread through neighborhoods that were already under economic stress, and it turned block-by-block tensions into full-scale gang warfare. The Crips, which had started in the late 1960s as a community protection organization, had by the 1980s fractured into dozens of rival sets. Grape Street Watts Crips, P.J. Watts Crips, Hoover Criminals, each controlling a few square blocks, each at war with the others. The Bloods emerged from a coalition of smaller gangs in response. Crack supplied the money that funded the turf wars, the guns that were used in them, and the funeral bills that resulted. By 1990, gang-related homicides in Los Angeles County exceeded 800 per year. Drive-by shootings were a near-nightly occurrence in Watts, Inglewood, and Compton. Children in those neighborhoods learned early how to identify the sound of different calibers. They learned which routes to take home from school to reduce the odds of catching a stray. The state responded to all of this with the one tool it had sharpened to the finest edge: the police. LAPD. Chief Darrell Gates had run the department since 1978, and he ran it like a general running an occupied territory. Under Gates, the LAPD became the laboratory for American urban policing. They developed the first SWAT unit in the country. They pioneered the use of the battering ram, a literal armored vehicle with a ram mounted to the front to punch through the walls of suspected drug houses. In 1987, Gates launched Operation Hammer, a series of mass sweeps through South Central and East Los Angeles. At its peak, in April 1988, officers arrested 1,453 people in a single weekend. Most were Black or Latino. Most were never charged. They were processed, fingerprinted, and released, their names now in a database, their communities further convinced that the department saw them as a population to be managed rather than citizens to be protected. Gates himself had, in a 1990 Senate hearing, suggested that casual drug users in America ought to be taken out and shot, a remark he later called a joke. The department culture he built was not a joke. It was a structure with training, incentives, and leadership that consistently rewarded aggression and insulated officers from accountability. By 1990, over 50,000 people, the majority of them minority males, had been arrested in Operation Hammer raids alone. The department used racial profiling openly. They stopped black men for driving certain cars in certain neighborhoods. They detained teenagers for wearing certain colors. The Christopher Commission, formed after a series of police scandals, found in 1989 that a significant number of LAPD officers routinely used excessive force and persistently ignored department guidelines. The commission documented that racial, gender, and sexual orientation biases regularly contributed to how force was applied. They called for sweeping reforms. Gates resisted most of them. A subsequent study found that 83% of LAPD officers lived outside the city limits of Los Angeles. They policed communities they did not live in, did not shop in, and had no personal stake in. They went home to the suburbs at the end of every shift. The communities they patrolled were, in every practical sense, somewhere else. Then there was the other layer of tension, the one that would surface most visibly during the riots, but had been building for years. The relationship between black residents and Korean immigrant business owners. Starting in the 1960s, Korean immigrants had moved into South Central neighborhoods that white business owners had abandoned. By 1990, Korean Americans operated roughly 70% of the businesses in South Central Los Angeles. Liquor stores, corner markets, small groceries. They worked long hours. Many lived outside the neighborhood. Language barriers and cultural differences created friction with black customers who felt disrespected in their own community. Korean store owners, dealing with real theft problems and constant economic pressure, were often tense and suspicious. Neither side fully understood the other, and neither had much structural support for bridging the gap. Legal scholar Alice Choi, writing later about the conflict, observed that neither group fully recognized the extent of the cultural and language barriers between them, and that absence of recognition made every small encounter a potential flashpoint. On March 16, 1991, 13 days after the Rodney King beating, that friction turned fatal. A 15-year-old black girl named Latasha Harlins walked into the Empire Liquor Market in South Central to buy a bottle of orange juice. Security footage showed her placing the juice in her backpack while holding money to pay for it. The store owner, Soon Ja-do, suspected she was shoplifting, so a scuffle broke out. As Harlins turned to leave with her money still in her hand, Do shot her in the back of the head. Harlins died instantly. A jury convicted Do of voluntary manslaughter. The jury recommended the maximum sentence, 16 years. The judge, Joyce Carlin, overrode that recommendation and sentenced Do to 5 years probation, 400 hours of community service, and a $500 fine. No jail time. The sentence was handed down in November 1991, the same autumn the Rodney King trial was being prepared. South Los Angeles absorbed both at the same time. The Harlins case and the King tape together made the same argument, that the life of a black person in Los Angeles had a specific and documented value, and that value was measurable in probation terms and $500 fines. The reaction inside the community to the Harlins sentence was immediate and sustained. Black community leaders organized boycotts of Korean-owned stores. The Brotherhood Crusade, a black civic organization, called for a sustained economic boycott of Korean-owned liquor stores in South Central. At memorial services for Harlins, speakers compared her death explicitly to what had happened to Rodney King. 2 incidents, months apart, in which black lives had been extinguished or brutalized, and the system had determined that accountability was optional. The comparison was not rhetorical. It was the conclusion that the evidence suggested. By the spring of 1992, the question in South Los Angeles was not whether people were angry. It was what that anger would eventually find to attach to. This is the city that existed when those 4 LAPD officers faced trial in early 1992. This is the ground that had been soaked in accelerant for 30 years. The verdict on April 29th was not the cause of what followed. It was the spark. The man in the tape. Rodney Glenn King was born on April 2nd, 1965 in Sacramento, California. He grew up in Pasadena, the son of Ronald and Odessa King. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to find consistent work and died by drowning in 1984. Rodney dropped out of high school and drifted through construction jobs. In 1989, he robbed a convenience store with a metal bar and spent a year in prison. By the time of the March 1991 incident, he was on parole, working construction, and, by his own later account, he was drinking more than he should have been and terrified of going back to prison. He was not affiliated with any gang. People who knew him called him Glenn. He liked fishing. He had 3 daughters. After his death in 2012, his family described him as a gentle man who struggled with addiction but wanted peace. Those details were largely absent from the coverage that followed the beating. What appeared instead was a framework built by the defense and repeated in the press: ex-convict, parole violator, high-speed chase, suspected PCP user. A subsequent drug test found no PCP in King's system at the time of the arrest, but by the time that was established, the narrative had already taken hold. The construction of King as a threatening figure, someone who had brought the beating on himself, was not incidental to the case. It was the entire defense strategy, and it required the jury to disbelieve what the tape showed with their own eyes. King himself described the night of the beating in interviews years later. He said he had been afraid from the moment the lights appeared behind him on the freeway. He knew he'd been drinking. He knew he was on parole. He knew what going back to prison meant. He said he had hoped, when he finally stopped the car, that if he cooperated enough, the officers would let him go without arresting him. He said he never anticipated what came next. He said the first baton strike felt like an electric shock traveling through his entire body. He said after the first few blows, he stopped feeling individual hits, and everything blurred into one continuous pain. On the night of March 2nd, 1991, King had been drinking with 2 friends, Brian Allen and Freddie Helms, at an apartment in Altadena. Around 12:30 a.m., they got into King's 1988 Hyundai. CHP officer Tim Singer attempted to pull King over for speeding at around 100 miles per hour on the Foothill Freeway. King, who knew he was on parole and had been drinking, didn't stop. He exited the freeway and drove through residential streets for several miles before pulling over near Hanson Dam Park. By that time, multiple LAPD units had joined the pursuit. The CHP officers ordered King's 2 passengers out of the car. They complied without incident and were placed in the back of a patrol car. Then the LAPD took over the stop. Sergeant Stacy Kuhn took charge of the scene. Officers Lawrence Powell, Timothy Wynn, and Theodore Briseno surrounded King as he exited the vehicle. Kuhn fired a taser. Then when King rose, Kuhn fired it again. After the second taser hit, Powell swung his baton at King's head like a baseball player at the plate. Wynn joined in. Briseno kicked King in the head. When King tried to rise, a movement officers would later describe as threatening, and that the video shows was the reflex of a man absorbing blow after blow. The strikes continued. The tape captured at least 56 baton blows. Not one of the officers present intervened to stop it. Holliday's footage ran for approximately 81 seconds. It doesn't show the beginning of the encounter. It starts with King already on the ground. And yet it was enough. Within 24 hours, the tape was on KTLA. Within 48 hours, it was on every major network. The Los Angeles Times published 43 articles about it in the first 2 weeks. The New York Times published 17. ABC News ran a 60-minute special. The footage was undeniable. It was visual, continuous, and it showed officers beating a prone man who had already been shot twice with a taser. Even Chief Gates, after watching it 25 times, said he could not believe what he was seeing, that he never dreamed he would witness his officers beat a man with batons 56 times while a sergeant stood by and did nothing. The Los Angeles County District Attorney charged all 4 officers with assault and use of excessive force. Community leaders called for accountability. Across the country, the tape circulated as confirmation of something millions of Black Americans had known their entire lives: that police violence against Black people was not an aberration, it was policy. Then the trial was moved to Simi Valley. Simi Valley, in Ventura County, was home to many LAPD officers and their families. It was overwhelmingly white and suburban. Prosecutors requested the venue change based on the level of media saturation in Los Angeles. Defense attorneys did not object. The resulting jury had no Black members: 9 white Americans, 1 biracial man, 1 Latina, and 1 Asian American woman. Several jurors had relatives in law enforcement. Several expressed during voir dire positive views of police and limited familiarity with or empathy for experiences of racial profiling. The defense built their strategy around a single tactic. They took Holliday's 81-second tape and broke it into individual frames. They played it in slow motion. They had experts testify that each frozen image showed a moment in which King could theoretically have been considered a threat. His arm raised here, his torso shifted there. What the tape showed in real time as a sustained one-sided beating was repackaged, frame by frame, as a series of individually defensible decisions. prosecutors later argued that the repeated slow-motion playback desensitized the jury to the violence, that by the time deliberations began, the footage had been stripped of its cumulative impact through sheer repetition. Each individual frame, isolated and analyzed like a photograph, could be explained. The continuous reality of 56 baton strikes on a man lying on the ground could not. The defense found a way to show the jury the photographs without letting them watch the film. The prosecution's case had additional weaknesses. Sergeant Kuhn was allowed to testify at length about LAPD use of force policy, framing each action as a trained response rather than a personal decision. Prosecutors failed to put King on the stand, fearing cross-examination about his criminal record and the night of the chase, which meant the jury never heard the beating described from inside it, and the venue had done its work. Several jurors, interviewed after the verdicts, said they had genuinely not believed the tape showed what most people thought it showed. One juror said the officers had to do what they had to do. That juror had a son in law enforcement. The jury deliberated for 7 days. On April 29, 1992, at 3:15 p.m., they returned their verdicts. All 4 officers were acquitted of assault. 3 were acquitted of using excessive force. The jury deadlocked only on 1 excessive force charge against Powell. Outside the Simi Valley Courthouse, film director John Singleton was standing in the crowd. He said, "By having this verdict, what these people done, they lit the fuse to a bomb." He was right. The bomb had been built over 30 years. The fuse was already burning. The first night, April 29th, 1992. The acquittals were read at 3:15 p.m. local time. By 3:45 p.m., a crowd of more than 300 people had gathered outside the Los Angeles County Courthouse. Mayor Tom Bradley held a press conference at 4:58 p.m. He expressed his own outrage at the verdict, said the jury had told the world that what everyone saw with their own eyes wasn't a crime. He also called for calm. The LAPD's assistant chief would later say he believed Bradley's remarks contributed to the escalation, that some residents interpreted the mayor's public anger as a signal. That claim was itself a deflection. The LAPD's failures that afternoon required no outside explanation. The department had known the verdict was coming for days. Commanders had set aside $1 million for potential overtime. And yet, on the day the verdict was delivered, 2/3 of the LAPD's patrol captains were out of town in Ventura County at a 3-day training seminar. The Emergency Operations Center was open, but described later by investigators as a room where the lights were turned on and the coffee pot plugged in. The people assigned to staff it weren't assembled until 4:45 p.m. Officers at the 3 p.m. shift change were allowed to go home. The department's internal risk assessment had come back low. Nobody adjusted that assessment when the verdict was announced. At approximately 5:30 p.m., a crowd gathered at the intersection of Florence Avenue and Normandy Avenue in South Central. Bottles were thrown at passing cars. When LAPD officers arrived and forcibly detained a 16-year-old named Shondell Daniels, a well-known face in the neighborhood, in front of a swelling crowd, the tension escalated sharply. Lieutenant Michael Moulin commanded the officers on scene. The crowd pushed closer. Objects were thrown. Someone in the crowd grabbed a flashlight from an officer's hand. Moulin looked at the crowd. He looked at the number of officers he had. He made a calculation. His order broadcast on a bullhorn and captured on video. "Hey, forget the flashlight. It's not worth it. It ain't worth it. Let's go." The officers retreated. They were sent to a bus depot at 54th and Arlington and told to wait for further instructions. The command post that formed there had no cell phones, no computers beyond patrol car units, not enough radio handsets, and no televisions. The commander staging those officers had no way to watch what was happening live on every local news channel. Florence and Normandy was now without any police presence whatsoever. At 6:43 p.m., a white truck driver named Larry Tarvin pulled up to a red light at Florence and Normandy, unaware he was driving into a riot. His truck had no radio. He was pulled from the vehicle, beaten with a fire extinguisher taken from his own truck, and left unconscious in the street for over a minute. An unknown black bystander helped him back into his cab and helped him drive out of the intersection. Seconds later, another truck pulled up to the same light. Reginald Denny was a 36-year-old white construction truck driver. No radio. He stopped at the intersection. A group of men identified afterward as Damian Williams, Henry Watson, Antoine Miller, and Gary Williams pulled him from the cab. Williams smashed a cinder block onto Denny's skull, fracturing it and leaving him with permanent brain damage and partial blindness. The attack was captured live from a news helicopter above. Reporter Zoe Tur broadcasting in real time from multiple Los Angeles stations. Millions of people watched it happen while it was still happening. 4 strangers watching the same broadcast drove to Florence and Normandy: Bobby Green Jr., Lei Yue, Titus Murphy, and Terry Barnett. They loaded Denny into his own truck and drove him to the hospital. He survived. The 4 rescuers were Black, Latino, and Asian. That detail got a fraction of the airtime given to the attack itself. When Denny was asked about the rescue years later, he said he hadn't even known who saved his life until afterward. He said he held no hatred for his attackers. He said the people who saved him came from the same neighborhood as the people who beat him. Almost an hour later, a Guatemalan construction worker named Fidel Lopez stopped at the same intersection. Rioters smashed his forehead open with a car stereo and tried to cut off his ear. After he lost consciousness, they spray painted his torso and genitals black. A black reverend named Benny Newton stepped between Lopez and the crowd and told them that if they wanted to kill him, they would have to kill him first. Lopez survived. Newton died of leukemia the following year. By 7:45 p.m., the first fire report came in. Police did not return to Florence and Normandy in force until 8:30 p.m., roughly 2 hours after the retreat order. In that window, Tom's Liquor had been looted by more than 100 people. Stores along Florence were being systematically stripped, and arson was moving block by block. Firefighters were staged and waiting for police escorts that didn't come. Meanwhile, Daryl Gates left the besieged Parker Center headquarters and drove to a fundraising event in Brentwood. The fundraiser opposed a ballot measure that would have given more civilian oversight to the police department. The measure would limit the power and term of the chief's office. Los Angeles was burning. Gates was fundraising to protect his own authority. He would later say he was unaware of the verdict's timing. The Webster Commission would conclude that the failures of that night were systemic, not the product of any single decision, but that Gates bore significant responsibility for the culture and command failures that produced them. The citywide tactical alert, the emergency protocol that pulls all available officers onto duty, was not issued until 6:43 p.m. The same moment Tarvin was being beaten at Florence and Normandy. At some points that night, fire calls were coming in once every minute. Mayor Bradley declared a state of emergency and requested National Guard assistance. The Guard had anticipated no major emergency and had loaned its riot equipment to other law enforcement agencies. It would take nearly 24 hours for the first full contingent of Guard troops to reach the city. The first night was the worst night, but it was not the last. 5 days, $1 billion. On April 30th, the second day, the fires were still going. Rioting had spread far beyond Florence and Normandy. By mid-morning, looting and arson had moved north from South Central through Koreatown, Westlake, Pico Union, Echo Park, Hancock Park, Fairfax, and reached Hollywood Boulevard. It spread west into Inglewood, Hawthorne, Gardena, Compton, and Long Beach. It spread east into Huntington Park, Southgate, and Linwood. Fire calls came in at the rate of 1 per minute at the peak. Eventually, 3,600 fires were set, destroying 1,100 buildings. The emergency broadcast system activated on 2 Los Angeles television stations for the first time in the city's history. Not a test, but the real thing. The neighborhood that suffered the most concentrated destruction was not in South Central. It was Koreatown, a 2.7 square mile stretch of Los Angeles situated between the wealthier West Side neighborhoods and the impoverished flatlands of South LA. The geography mattered. When the violence reached Koreatown, it reached a community positioned, both literally and politically, in a gap between 2 worlds, with protection promised by neither. When the looting started, Korean business owners called 911. Many couldn't get through. Those who did were told to fend for themselves. LAPD and National Guard units, where they were deployed at all, focused their resources on Beverly Hills and West Hollywood, the wealthy, predominantly white independent cities to the west of Koreatown. One Korean American resident later described what that meant in practice. The police cut off traffic into Koreatown while residents were trapped inside without protection, because those roads led somewhere richer. The barrier was not accidental. It was a consequence of where the department's priorities landed when choices had to be made under pressure. Left without law enforcement, Korean business owners organized their own defense. Groups of men, many of them veterans of the South Korean military, climbed onto rooftops with rifles, shotguns, and handguns. Television cameras captured open gun battles. Korean shopkeepers armed with M1 carbines and Ruger Mini 14s exchanging fire with looters and forcing them back. Those images went everywhere. They became iconic. And they also, in the national conversation that followed, became a distraction from the more difficult question: Why were civilian business owners having to fight off rioters on rooftops while the police protected neighborhoods to the west? The scale of the destruction was severe. Over 2,300 Korean-owned businesses were looted or burned, representing approximately half of all property damage in the city. The Korean American community calls what happened to them Saigu, the Korean pronunciation of April 29th, 429. The name endures because the wound did. A survey conducted afterward found that 15% of Korean college-age students dropped out of school due to psychological trauma. Families lost everything they had accumulated over a generation. Many never recovered it. In the year after the riots, fewer than 1 in 4 damaged or destroyed Korean-owned businesses had reopened. The political response moved slowly. On May 1st, Governor Pete Wilson requested federal assistance. President George H.W. Bush invoked the Insurrection Act, federalizing the California National Guard and authorizing the deployment of U.S. military forces. The 40th Infantry Division of the National Guard was reinforced by 2,000 soldiers from the Army's 7th Infantry Division at Fort Ord and 1,500 Marines from the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. More than 10,000 troops were eventually activated, the largest military occupation of any American city since the 1968 Washington, D.C. riots. The deployment of federal troops was not ready until Saturday. By then, the worst of the violence was already over. On the morning of May 1st, Rodney King himself stood outside a Beverly Hills courthouse and spoke to television cameras. He was visibly shaken. He said, "People, I just want to say, can we all get along? Can we get along?" By the end of May 3rd, the formal unrest was over. The curfew lifted. Schools, banks, and businesses began reopening. Federal troops remained until May 9th, the National Guard until May 14th. Some Guard soldiers were still present as late as May 27th. The final count, 63 people dead, 2 Asian, 28 Black, 19 Latino, 14 white. No law enforcement officials killed, 2,383 people reported injured, more than 12,000 arrested. Property damage exceeding $1 billion, nearly 3,767 buildings damaged or destroyed. The media coverage of those 6 days shaped how the events would be remembered, and that shaping was selective from the start. Harvard's Joan Shorenstein Center analyzed local and network newscasts from the period and found that local stations focused heavily on sensational violence, portraying people of color primarily as criminals or victims. Latinos made up more than half of those arrested and roughly 1/3 of business owners who lost property, yet they were the subject of only 1/10 of news reports. The dominant national narrative was a story about black men attacking white people. Reginald Denny's beating looped on every channel. The 4 people who saved Denny's life, a black man, a black woman, a Latino man, and an Asian American woman, were covered as a footnote to the attack, if they were covered at all. That version of events, clean, racially legible, reducible to footage, was the one that stuck. The underlying reality was more complicated and less televisable. A multi-ethnic uprising rooted in class inequality, driven by 30 years of accumulated pressure and answered with fire because no other response had worked. The truths they didn't cover. There's a part of this story that almost no major outlet covered in real time. It happened not during the riots, but the day before them. And it may be the most significant thing that occurred in Los Angeles that entire week. On April 28, 1992, 24 hours before the verdict was announced, leaders of 4 major gangs signed a peace treaty at the Imperial Court's housing projects in Watts. The gangs were the Bounty Hunter Bloods, the Grape Street Watts Crips, the PJ Watts Crips, and the Hacienda Village Bloods. The agreement committed them to a ceasefire, established neutral zones and shared territory, and created a mediation process for future disputes. They called it the Watts Gang Treaty. The treaty did not emerge overnight. It was the product of months of sustained organizing by community activists, most prominently Dode Sherrills and his brother Aquila Sherrills, who had been facilitating dialogue among rival gang leaders for much of early 1992. They were influenced by gang peace efforts they had studied in Chicago and New York, and they were motivated by a clear and specific goal. The people in these housing projects were losing children to gunfire on a regular basis, and neither the police nor the city government was doing anything that worked, so they decided to try something else. To create the formal document, Anthony Perry, a former gang member turned community organizer, went to the USC library and photocopied the 1949 Egypt-Israel Armistice Agreement. He and the Sherrills brothers used that international framework as a template, defined territories, specific prohibitions on violent acts, agreed upon mechanisms for settling future disputes. The treaty's preamble stated directly that the signatories wanted to prevent the warlike destruction that had characterized their neighborhoods and to improve community life. These were not symbolic gestures. They were drafting a ceasefire with the same structural logic that two nations use when they decide to stop shooting at each other. When the verdict came down the next day and the city ignited, Watts held. The neighborhood at the center of the 1965 riots, the neighborhood that everyone expected to explode first, did not explode. Rival gang members who had been shooting at each other for years were now patrolling blocks together, deterring outsiders, protecting businesses from people who came in from elsewhere to loot. The truce did not prevent every act of violence. It was a ceasefire, not a magic spell. But it held the neighborhood together in a way that no police force managed to do in any comparable area of the city that week. Harvard's Civil Rights Civil Liberties Law Review documented what followed over the next 6 years. Gang homicides in Los Angeles County fell from 803 in 1992 to 399 in 1998. Drive-by shootings dropped from 1,548 in 1991 to 1,070 in 1993. Researchers who studied the data identified the Watts Truce as a meaningful contributing factor to that decline. A decade after the treaty was signed, homicide rates in Watts remained measurably lower than they had been before. The truce was fragile, and some sets that didn't sign it continued their violence, but the numbers moved in a direction that nothing else had managed to move them. The LAPD dismissed the truce initially. Some officers speculated openly that it was a coordinated strategy by gangs to reduce police scrutiny while reorganizing. National news organizations largely ignored it. What ran everywhere was footage from Florence and Normandy. What didn't run was the story of several hundred men in the most written-off neighborhood in Los Angeles choosing to deliberately, methodically, using a document modeled on an international peace treaty that they had photocopied from a university library, not to kill each other anymore. In the years that followed, the truce got mythologized in a specific and distorting way. Many who told the story described it as something that emerged spontaneously from the riots, a kind of shock-induced awakening triggered by watching Los Angeles burn. That is not accurate. The treaty was negotiated over months and signed the day before the verdict. It was not a reaction to chaos. It was an attempt to prevent it. The distinction matters because it means the truce was not a miracle or an anomaly. It was a strategy, and strategies can be replicated. The silence around the truce in 1992 was not simply an oversight. It reflected what the media and political establishment chose to make legible about what happened. A story about gang members signing an armistice while the police retreated did not fit neatly into either side of the available narratives, neither the law and order framework that wanted to cast the riots as pure criminality, nor the civil rights framework that wanted to center police misconduct. The truce was something more specific and harder to categorize. Evidence that the people most blamed for the violence in South Los Angeles were, in some cases, the most organized force for preventing it. What happened in Watts in April 1992 is a record of what becomes possible when people with nothing but their own agency decide to use it. When, instead of waiting for institutions that have consistently failed them, they build something themselves. While the LAPD was staging at a bus depot with no working televisions, while Gates was at a fundraiser in Brentwood, while the National Guard was scrambling to locate riot equipment it had loaned out, people in Watts were sitting across from their enemies and signing an armistice using a photocopy of a 1949 Middle East peace agreement. The city did not give them credit for it. It rarely does. What changed and what didn't? After the riots subsided, the investigations began. The Webster Commission released its findings in October 1992. It found that the LAPD had failed at virtually every level of preparation and response. No citywide tactical alert until after violence began. Officers released at shift change with no contingency plan. Command posts with no televisions and insufficient radios. A retreat order at Florence and Normandy with no plan to re-engage, and department leadership that was largely absent or paralyzed during the critical first hours. Much of the blame concentrated on Gates, who had been at a political fundraiser while the city burned. Gates was forced to resign on June 28, 1992. The federal government prosecuted the 4 officers on civil rights charges. In April 1993, a federal jury convicted Sergeant Stacy Kuhn and Officer Lawrence Powell. Each received 30 months in federal prison. Wynn and Briseno were acquitted on federal charges as well. All 4 eventually left the LAPD. None returned to law enforcement in any form. King filed a civil suit against the city of Los Angeles and was awarded $3.8 million in damages. He invested part of the settlement in a record label. He started a construction company. Both failed. He continued to struggle with alcohol and substance use for the rest of his life. Arrested multiple times on charges ranging from domestic disputes to driving under the influence, he spoke publicly about wanting to be more than the image people had assigned him. He rarely succeeded in escaping it. In April 2012, he told an interviewer that his sobriety was a work in progress. He was engaged to be married when he died 2 months later. On June 17, 2012, King was found at the bottom of his swimming pool in Rialto, California. He was 47 years old. An autopsy found alcohol, cocaine, and PCP in his system. His death was ruled an accidental drowning. His eldest daughter, Laura King, later established the Rodney King Foundation for Social Justice and Human Rights. The LAPD, in the years following the riots, underwent the most significant institutional reform in its history. A federal consent decree in 2001 mandated new use of force policies, independent oversight, and mandatory data collection. Officer-involved shootings dropped from 108 in 1992 to 37 in 2021. The department's demographics shifted significantly. By the 2020s, it was 52% Hispanic, 28% white, 11% Asian and Pacific Islander, and 9% black. Chokeholds were banned. Body cameras were deployed across all patrol units. These are real documented changes. They are also incomplete. Many of the vacant lots created by the 1992 fires were still undeveloped in 2022. Median household income in Watts and Florence remains significantly below the city average. Grocery stores and banks that left South Los Angeles in 1992 took decades to return in any meaningful way. Many Korean businesses never reopened. The Rebuild LA program that promised $6 billion in private investment and 74,000 new jobs largely failed to materialize. A 2010 survey found that 77% of Los Angeles residents felt the economic situation in the city had significantly worsened since 1992. Between 1992 and 2007, the black population of Los Angeles dropped by 123,000 people, while the Latino population grew by more than 450,000. A demographic shift driven partly by the economic devastation that followed the uprising and was never fully corrected. The 1992 uprising is also the moment when citizen video became a political force in America. George Holliday's tape established that an ordinary person with a consumer camera could create a document that no institution could erase. In the 3 decades that followed, Amadou Diallo, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, that pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency and decreasing barriers to recording. The cameras multiplied. The pattern they documented did not disappear. What the 1992 uprising proved, and what the years since have confirmed, is that video alone does not produce accountability. The Rodney King tape was clear. The jury still acquitted. The structural conditions that produced the beating, the paramilitary policing, the racial profiling, the economic abandonment of entire neighborhoods, the accumulated injustice of 30 years, are not resolved by a single verdict, or a single reform, or a single uprising. They require sustained, deliberate change at the level of institutions and investment. The Christopher Commission said this in 1989. The Webster Commission said it again in 1992. The California Assembly Special Committee titled their post-riot report "To Rebuild Is Not Enough" and reached the same conclusion. The findings have never been seriously disputed. The response has remained incomplete. The Korean American community rebuilt partly, incompletely, and largely without the government assistance that had been promised. Many families never received significant aid from Rebuild LA, the public-private initiative launched with considerable fanfare by former Ambassador Peter Ueberroth. The program raised about $400 million of its promised $6 billion and created a fraction of its promised jobs. The communities that had suffered the most, South Central, Koreatown, Pico Union, watched the machinery of recovery move slowly, selectively, and away from them. The bitter irony of Koreatown's position in 1992 had a sequel in the years after. The neighborhood that was unprotected during the riots was then underserved during the recovery, and the families that survived did so largely through their own collective effort, not through any institutional support that arrived on time. What remains, 33 years after the verdict, is a set of facts that resist easy resolution. 63 people died. More than 12,000 were arrested. $1 billion burned. The 4 officers who beat Rodney King on camera were acquitted by a jury that watched the same tape the rest of the country watched. 2 of them eventually served 30 months in federal prison. The others did not. The men in Watts who signed a peace treaty the day before the riots are rarely mentioned in the same sentence as the riots themselves. The 4 people who saved Reginald Denny's life are rarely mentioned in the same sentence as the attack on him. The 50% unemployment rate in South Central is rarely mentioned in the same sentence as the looting. These omissions are not accidental. They are how a story gets simplified until it can be filed away. Rodney King spent the rest of his life trying to be something other than what happened to him on March 3, 1991. He mostly couldn't. He is remembered primarily for a question he asked while his city was on fire, a question that seemed naive to some and profound to others, and that has never been fully answered. The city that burned is still here. The question still is too.